The Loch Ness Road is just what my dad called it. Its actual name is the less glamorous A9. It runs from Perth all the way up to the north of Scotland, passing through the tiny city of Inverness, which was where my grandparents lived. I've spent too many hours of my life on that road, driving the long drive from Glasgow to Inverness. I know it inside out, really. I know where there's bends in the road. I know the places where I can go fast, the places where the traffic police sit with their speed traps, and I know that part of the road where people shouldn't be at night. The 3 or 4 mile stretch where I've seen and heard things that I can't explain. My brother Angus has 4 years on me, which isn't a big deal now that we're both in our 30s, but back when I was 10 and he was 14, my parents relied on him for all the manual labour chores. He hated the way I'd sit on the couch watching television while he had to help my dad put flat-pack furniture together, a big grin on my face. He sat in the front seat of the car that night. We'd left my grandparents' house at around 10 p.m, so that must have put us on that stretch of the A9 around 11ish. It was a clammy night. Not a breath of wind blew through the trees as we made our way down that darkened road. My dad was driving, Angus in the front, me in the back, face buried in my Game Boy. My mum and little sister Chloe had left my grandparents earlier that afternoon. Angus, my dad and I had stayed behind to help them clean up the house a little after the party. We'd been celebrating their 50th wedding anniversary. The whole family was there. Things just seemed much simpler when I was 10. We hadn't passed any other cars for a while, which was pretty typical for that time of night. Just us 3 souls in that beat-up Volvo, the headlights cutting a path through the dark. The road was lined on either side with heavy trees and bushes which seemed to absorb any slivers of light the moon could offer. The trees rose tall into the night sky, swooping over and encasing the road and the travellers who found themselves on it. There were acres of those woods to either side of us. The Loch Ness Road cut straight through the middle of that wilderness. Angus was fiddling with the buttons on the radio, desperately trying to tune his MP3 player onto one of those empty frequencies. The car was filled with the sound of crackling white noise, intermittent bursts of Green Day, and my dad's moaning at my brother to hurry up and pick a damn song. I only looked up from my Game Boy when I realised we were slowing down.
"Oh, what the hell?"
my dad muttered, bringing the car to a stop. The blackness engulfed our car as we idled there. We could have been a mile under the sea, the way the darkness seemed to encapsulate us.
"Why have we stopped?"
I asked. My dad pointed silently to the road ahead. The car's headlights crept across the road and illuminated the log that blocked our path.
"Shit! Must have fallen off one of those damn trucks."
My dad groaned as he opened the door.
"Angus, give me a hand with this."
My dad and my brother both stepped out of the car, leaving their doors open to the night as I huddled in the back seat. Angus was muttering under his breath, bemoaning the fact that it was always him, how it wasn't fair that I was never asked to help. I watched on as they walked the beams of light the headlights provided and approached the obstacle. The log must have been about 8 feet long, a couple of feet in diameter too, a few stray branches protruding from its sides that would have made mincemeat of our tyres had we attempted to drive over it. I remember feeling anxious in those moments, but I didn't know why. My eyes darted between the safety of my family to the blackness which awaited me outside those open doors. It was like that feeling you get when you're floating in the open sea. You know there's not much chance of something reaching up from the murky depths and dragging you down, but you don't know for sure. Danger lurks in the darkness. Even at 10 years old I knew that. The horror is in the unknown. I felt that as I peered out of the window, my eyes desperately trying to adjust.
"Jesus, this thing's heavy."
My dad wheezed as they began to roll the log off the road, the sound of the wood scraping on the tarmac amplified by the vacuum we found ourselves in. I watched as they edged it further and further. I could see the strain on their faces, the sweaty foreheads and puffed out cheeks.
"Nearly there. Just..."
Angus stopped, his bowed head raised and staring off into the darkness. I remember how hard my heart started racing when I saw how wide his eyes were. He had heard something. Something that had drained the colour from his face and trembled through his arms. My dad shot him a glare. He seemed puzzled as to why my brother had stiffened up. But that confusion gave way to that contagious fear. My dad went to open his mouth, but the sight of my brother's quivering lips seemed to shake him just as bad. Had Angus seen something moving through the dark? Had he heard something in those woods? My dad's eyes seemed to dart to something behind Angus. I could see his arms start to tremble, the log rocking back and forth a little. Then he turned his head to me. God only knows what was running through his mind at that moment. He looked at those two open doors. I could tell he was regretting not closing them. That scared the shit out of me. We all remained completely still for a few seconds. We'd seen the horror movies. We'd heard the ghost stories. No matter how old or brave you think you are, when you find yourself stranded in that encompassing darkness, your mind starts to race. What if?
Right. Move it, son. Come on.
My dad broke the silence. It seemed to be enough to snap Angus out of his daze. He shuffled that log across the road with much greater ease.
Come on, hurry up.
I called out, an audible tremble in my voice.
Shh. Shut up. Shut up.
Angus hissed back, an audible panic in his. I was on the edge of my seat in the back of the car. I had no idea what had spooked my dad and my brother, but I knew it was in our best interest to get the hell out of there as soon as possible. My fingers curled around the cheap fabric on those seats, and I became fidgety, my feet tapping away of their own accord.
Hurry up, please,
I whispered, my eyes still darting around in the dark. One of the protruding branches snagged a divot out of Angus's side. He let out a yelp as he furiously kicked at the branch.
Come on, you bastard!
He shouted, kicking away furiously at it. If my dad had heard him cursing under any other circumstance, he'd have faced a serious rollicking. But this wasn't a normal circumstance. My dad was only interested in getting us out of there. He dropped his end over the ditch by the side of the road and made his way to Angus. And then they both stopped again. Angus took a step back, while staring off into those woods. He looked to his left, and then his right. I could tell he'd heard something, but couldn't identify where from.
Move!
My dad growled, pushing Angus aside, bringing a heavy boot down and snapping the problem branch clean off. With a final push, they managed to roll the obstruction into a ditch, and then quickly hurried back to our car. Angus raced ahead, throwing himself inside, then slamming the door. My dad was a little slower, but I hadn't seen him move that quickly in years. He put his hand on the roof of the car, then stopped, as if to take a final look back.
Dad, please, just get in, please.
Angus and I begged and pleaded almost in unison.
It's okay. I'm just having a look. Dad, stop fucking about!
Angus screamed, his voice cracking in desperation. Looking back now, I think my dad knew we'd seen him panicking as he shuffled that log, and he felt safe enough standing there with one foot in the car to prove some sort of point. I guess he didn't want his sons to think he was as easily scared as a couple of kids, like he was proving to us that he was the sensible adult.
Okay, Jesus! Calm down, you two. There's nothing even there.
He groaned as he closed the door. I noticed how quickly his hand swept towards the electronic locks, though, pressing the key symbol 4 or 5 times in quick succession to ensure no one was getting inside the car.
What happened?
I whispered. The two of them shared a look, but said nothing.
Did you see something, Angus?
Again he sat stony-faced.
I heard... Enough of that bloody nonsense!
My dad interrupted him, the car quickly pulling away along the road. In that moment, I made one of the worst mistakes of my life. An error that's kept me up at night and provided me with an image I can't scrub from my memory. I looked back. I peered into the abyss as we picked up some speed. The darkness seemed to shift a little, swirling in the pittance of light from the back of our car. 2, 3, maybe even 4 shapes emerged from the woods. I choked on the air which tried to escape my lungs. It caught behind my tongue, and I could feel the pressure in my throat. There were at least 4 of them, tall, slender, and darkened. They moved quickly across the road so gracefully it was like they were floating. 2 at the front and 2 at the back. They replaced that log on the road with ease. The obstacle was there once more within seconds. It was as if we'd never been there. As swiftly as they'd appeared, they disappeared back into the tree line. I tried to scream out, even muster up the slightest of noises, but I couldn't. I looked on helplessly as my mind raced with those terrible thoughts. I turned around and slumped back into my seat. We never spoke a word to each other the whole way home. I've never told Angus or my dad what I saw that night. I wasn't sure they'd believe me. Or maybe it would be worse if they did. My dad finally broke the silence in the driveway as we pulled in behind my mum's car.
Not a word to your mother. You hear me?
Angus and I nodded silently. Angus didn't say much after we got back that night. I heard my mum and dad argue about it. Mum wanted to take him to the doctor, but Dad insisted he was just going through a mopey teenage phase. I knew he'd seen or heard something that night. Something had changed him. It was around 3 weeks later that he spoke to me again. I got up from bed in the middle of the night for a glass of water and found him sitting at the kitchen table, his eyes staring off into the dark.
What did you see?
I whispered. There was no need to preface it. We both knew I was talking about that night. He sat there motionless, except for a twinge in his bottom lip, as an image flashed through his mind.
Nothing,
he replied.
Did you hear something? Voices.
He turned to me.
Nasty voices. What did they say?
Angus turned away, looking through that black window.
Let them pass. No women.